Facebook and YouTube both. And it is going to be recorded. So it will show up on in both places. You can go to Facebook and go to the church's homepage and get the recording. You can go to YouTube and go to the church's YouTube channel and get the recording. And hopefully by the end of the week, you can go to the Francis Schaeffer Study Center YouTube channel and get the recording there as well. So, welcome. It's a Tuesday night in November. I'm trying to do these once a month, so this is the fall lecture for November. We did Constantine last month, and I'm going to come back and do Dante next month. And I'm having a great time because the online high school class that I teach right now just is 2/3 of the way through the Inferno. We do the whole Commedia over the course of 9 lessons, 4.5 weeks. Yeah, we spent about a month and a half reading the Commedia together. So I'm excited about that. And I actually dressed up as Dante today. It's
Give the date in December?
Oh, yes, it is the 10th. It is the 10th. Yep. So, without further ado, yes, I am Rob Shearer, and these lectures are all sponsored by the Francis Schaeffer Study Center, which was founded in 2004. Our mission is to promote a biblical worldview through the study of history, literature, and art, and we honor Francis Schaeffer, who was a very influential theologian and apologist in the 20th century. My students keep reminding me we're in the 21st century now. But yeah, it's like, can I use this source? It's from the late 20th century. And I'm going, excuse me? I'm from the late 20th century. But, okay. In addition to these lectures, Schaeffer Study Center also offers a high school program built around an integrated chronological study of Western civilization, beginning with the ancient world in 9th grade, finishing with the 20th century in 12th grade. And we've got a few students here, if you want to get the inside scoop, who apparently couldn't resist and have come back to hear me once again. My background, those of you who've come to these know all of this, although I had to update this slide because one of the key facts had changed. I no longer have 19 grandchildren. I now have 20 grandchildren. So yeah, 9 boys, 11 girls, and number 21 is due around Thanksgiving. Yeah, so we'll have to update it again before the next slide. My training is as a historian. I've done a little bit of a bunch of other things along the way. I do joke sometimes, and my wife believes me when I say I haven't quite figured out what I want to be when I grow up. But I do enjoy this. This has been my passion, and among other things, I occasionally get to go visit some of these historic sites with my students and with friends of the Schaeffer Study Center. So, yeah, that's us in the Vatican in Rome before Raphael's fresco of the School of Athens. And when I'm on tour, I wear a red hat, just not to confuse me with Dante. All right, just out of curiosity, what's one thing you already know about Augustine? He wrote a lot.
He's the most influential person most people have never heard of.
The most influential people that most people have never heard of. Yes.
He's responsible for
The idea of original sin. He certainly promotes it. I don't know whether it's original with him. That would be interesting.
He has a nice city in Florida.
And there's a nice city in Florida named after him. Yes, indeed, although with a different pronunciation. So the saint is Augustine and the city is Augustine. So, yeah. All right. All of the European philosophical tradition is just a series of footnotes to Plato. I could argue that. I could argue the positive on that for quite a while, and I think I'd come out ahead. A paraphrase applied to our topic for tonight is that all of theological history of Christianity in the West is just a series of footnotes to Augustine. And I'll try and demonstrate that as we go along. He was certainly the leading Christian apologist of his time. He was a bishop for 35 years at a fairly significant city in North Africa, the Roman province of North Africa, a very prolific author. Wrote letters. His sermons were transcribed and collected. There is a new translation into English for the 21st century in 42 volumes for anybody who wants to dive into this. Confessions and City of God are his most famous works, and they have been read by Christians in every century since they were written. They were never forgotten. They, in fact, remain the mainstay of the church during the Middle Ages. I'll talk more about that later. I would argue that he is, in fact, the most influential theologian after St. Paul in the history of the church. There's the geography of his life. Born in North Africa, as an adult, pursuing his chosen career of teaching and practicing rhetoric, he moved from the province of North Africa for a time to Rome, where he won some renown and fame, and then to the city of Milan, because that's where the emperor was in his day, and got an appointment by the imperial court, and fell under the influence of the bishop of Milan, because he was not a Christian. His mother was a Christian, but he was not. And he was in his 30s. And one of the little footnotes that my students have always found amusing is the explanation for why he wound up listening to Ambrose's sermons. Because somebody told him the music was really worth listening to. So he went to church for the music. And because he's in the church for the music, he happens to start hearing the sermons by Ambrose, who was quite the speaker of his own day. And Ambrose actually persuaded him of the intellectual underpinnings of Christianity, the trustworthiness of it, and his own need for the gospel. And so he became a convert to Christianity. I'll say more about that later on. He winds up going back home. He goes from Milan back to North Africa. His father had died. His mother dies before she had accompanied him to Italy. She dies before getting back to the province. So there was actually a small sum of money that he inherited, enough to buy a little villa in the countryside where he thought he would live out his days like some of the great Greek philosophers, with a little salon of fellow thinkers, and they would just read and study and pray and meditate, and he'd have a chance to write. He's visiting the church in Hippo, which is the capital city of the province of North Africa, and the bishop is preaching, because he is at this point a committed Christian. He does attend church services. And the bishop is making an appeal to the congregation. He says, we have new churches springing up, and we have pastors who have died or retired. We need some new pastors for these churches. And somebody in the back goes, Augustine's over here. And Augustine's like, no. So they persuade Augustine. The congregation and the bishop persuade Augustine to seek ordination, become a pastor. Within just a year or two, the bishop dies, and by acclamation, the people of the city want Augustine to be the new bishop. So he becomes the bishop of Hippo and serves in that capacity from 395. So he's only 41 when he becomes bishop, until his death in 430. So 35 years he's a bishop. Context, key context. The Edict of Milan, we talked about Constantine last month. He became emperor in 306. He issued an edict of toleration for Christians in 313, called the Council of Nicaea in 325, died in 337. Julian is, I think, a nephew. He's from the same family. He became sole emperor in 331, and he is the last emperor who is not a Christian. Julian tried to restore worship in the pagan temples, and The key event in Augustine's life, and the event that is closely connected to his most famous book, was the sack of Rome by Alaric in 410 AD. And in fact, the whole wave of Germanic invasions that had started right around 400 eventually is the context for Augustine's death. The Vandals make their way all the way to the province of North Africa, and they are besieging the city of Hippo, and Augustine dies during the siege. got a few more details about that later on I'll work into. Here we go. 5 million words. Sermons on selected lessons of the New Testament, writings on the Old Testament, a very influential essay on the Trinity, and the two works that people know him for now are City of God and Confessions. And I want to say just a word or two about these two. Augustine's Confessions first, because this is the thing that people usually start with. And the astonishing thing about this is it's written in the early 5th century. So it's written 1,500 years ago. And yet it's a psychological autobiography. He talks about his own feelings, his laments, the things he regrets, the things he hopes for. He includes sort of spontaneous prayers. He reflects upon his youth. And in fact, one of the commentators here says that he was already known as an eloquent speaker and a saintly figure in his personal life and an apologist for Christianity. And so he starts out the Confessions trying to disabuse everybody of this idea that he's been a saint his whole life. He says, I've not. He says, here, let me read you this quote because I found it fascinating. In the Confessions, Augustine paints so black a picture of his past that the reader may easily lose sight of the good qualities which he certainly possessed as a young man. Whether he was a greater sinner than others living in the notorious city of Carthage, we cannot tell, but whatever his vices, they were not without compensating virtues. Some of the most striking passages in the book are those in which he writes of his mother. And it is clear that he was always a good and affectionate son, though he may not have appreciated St. Monica's true worth until after her own conversion, or after his own conversion. On her deathbed, she told him that she had never heard him speak a harsh word against her. And this is not hard to believe. For whatever other sins he felt himself bound to confess, unkindness to others was not one of them. So very, very interesting. This book could have been written yesterday. I'll read you a couple of his own passages. Two of the most famous are his account of a little teenage hijinks episode where he and his thug buddies decided they were going to go rob the pears out of a neighbor's vineyard. And let me just read this to you because, again, he's writing in pretty clear classical Latin. This is an English translation, but it still catches what I think is the flavor of it. No thief can bear that another thief should steal from him, even if he's rich and the other is driven to it by want. Yet I was willing to steal, and steal I did, although I was not compelled by any lack, unless it were the lack of a sense of justice or a distaste for what was right and a greedy love of doing wrong. For of what I stole, I already had plenty, and much better at that. And I had no wish to enjoy the things I coveted by stealing, but only to enjoy the theft itself and the sin. There was a pear tree near our vineyard, loaded with fruit that was attractive, neither to look at nor to taste. Late one night, a band of ruffians, myself included, went off to shake down the fruit and carry it away, for we had continued our games out of doors until well after dark, as was our pernicious habit. Yeah, nothing good happens after dark, kiddos. Okay. We took away an enormous quantity of pears, not to eat them ourselves, but simply to throw them to the pigs. Perhaps we ate some of them, but our real pleasure consisted in doing something that was forbidden. It's like teenagers in 400 AD. And you go, yeah, this could have been captured last week. Let me flip now. There's a long storied course to his life. He's obviously very intelligent, very well read. Although he's exposed to Christianity, he never adopts it for himself. He pursues Greek philosophers. He pursues some Eastern religious cults. Always thought that Christianity was somehow not quite intellectually respectable, and that the Bible was not really that eloquently written. It was rather simple and straightforward and could not compare with the flourish of Greek and Latin authors of his day. But as I mentioned, he's going to church. He's listening to the preaching of Ambrose, who himself is a very well-read man. And he becomes convinced because he's tried the other religions. He's read all the Greek philosophers. He is in his 30s. And he's not found them satisfying at all in the end. In fact, he's disappointed that the ones he thought might have some answer to the secret of the universe and the meaning of life, when he really dove into it, it just wasn't there. So Ambrose has convinced him that Christianity, the gospel, both the Old and New Testament, the theology of the church has the answers that he's looking for. But he's unwilling to join the church. And this is also just a fascinating psychological detail for a single reason. He has a mistress, and he doesn't want to give her up. In fact, he says, when I was in my 20s, I did occasionally pray the prayer. He says, I'm not sure it was actually to God, but I did pray the prayer, Lord, make me chaste, but not yet. That's a quote from Augustine. So he's become convinced that Christianity is true, but he doesn't want to give in because he doesn't want to give up his mistress. I was asking myself these questions. I felt I was still the captive of my sins, and in my misery I kept crying, how long shall I go on saying tomorrow, tomorrow? Why not now? Why not make an end of my ugly sins at this moment? I was asking myself these questions, weeping all the while with the most bitter sorrow in my heart, when all at once I heard the sing-song voice of a child in a nearby house. Whether it was the voice of a boy or a girl, I cannot say. But again and again it repeated the refrain, take it and read, take it and read. The Latin is actually a little more poetic. It's tolle lege. Imperative, take, read. At this I looked up, thinking hard whether there was any kind of game in which children used to chant words like these, but I could not remember ever hearing them before. I stemmed my flood of tears and stood up, telling myself that this could only be a divine command to open my book of Scripture and read the first passage on which my eyes should fall. I always caution my students, don't do this.
Yeah, right.
But in this case, God used it. For I had heard the story of Anthony, St. Anthony, and I remembered how he had happened to go into a church while the gospel was being read and had taken it as a counsel addressed to himself when he heard the words, go home and sell all that belongs to you. That's how St. Anthony became a monk. So I hurried back to the place where Alypius, that's his best friend, was sitting. For when I stood up to move away, I had put down the book containing Paul's epistles. I seized it and opened it, and in silence I read the first passage on which my eyes fell. Quote, not in reveling and drunkenness, not in lust and wantonness, not in quarrels and rivalries, rather, arm yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ. Spend no more thought on nature and nature's appetites. That's actually Romans 13:13, but of course, Augustine not only did not have verse numbers, he didn't have chapter divisions. It's got a book of Paul's epistles, and there is a heading that says his epistle to the Romans, and then the text. I had no wish to read more, and no need to do so. For in an instant, as I came to the end of the sentence, it was as though the light of confidence flooded into my heart, and all the darkness of doubt was dispelled. I marked the place with my finger, or by some other sign, and closed the book. My looks now were quite calm as I told Alypius what had happened to me. He, too, told me what he had been feeling, which, of course, I did not know. He asked to see what I had read. I showed it to him, and he read on beyond the text which I had read. I did not know what followed, but it was this. Find room among you for a man of over-delicate conscience. Alypius applied this to himself and told me so. This admonition was enough to give him strength, and without suffering the distress of hesitation, he made his resolution and took this good purpose to himself. And it very well suited his moral character, which had long been far, far better than my own. And then the next line just kills me. I love this. Then we went in and told my mother, who was overjoyed, because she'd been praying for him for 20 years. And she is the Santa Monica, for whom the island off the coast of California is named. And that's how Augustine became a Christian. And that's his own account, his own autobiography of his experience of coming to faith. So, and it's a famous, famous passage. And there's just an interesting congruence between the fall of Adam and Eve in the garden by eating from the apple, and Augustine telling the story of his own misspent youth stealing pears. I think Augustine was quite conscious of the parallels. I don't think that means he invented the story. I think it really happened. The details that he includes tend you toward that. So yeah, there are 13 books. He talks about his early life, his childhood, his conversion, his reflections. He examines his own memory. He's self-aware. He talks about, why am I at war with myself? Why do I want to be good, but I keep doing things that I know are wrong and bad? And in a kind of an interesting little side note, and this is kind of classic Augustine, the last few books of the Confessions, he goes off on a commentary of Genesis and the nature of time. And I have told my students that I believe Augustine is the Jordan Peterson of the 5th century. And I say that because of City of God. City of God is massive. It had a particular occasion. It was a defense of Christianity against the charge by pagan Romans that it was their fault that Rome had fallen to the pagans. And Augustine says, well, I can take that on. And it's actually composed of 22 books, each of which is about 40 or 50 pages. And I refer to them as Augustine's podcasts, because they're like 2-hour Jordan Peterson podcasts. And they are connected. There are some threads that run through them, but he's off here and he's off there, and he wants to talk about miraculous events, and he wants to talk about the age of the earth, and he wants to talk about how, well, we all know the earth is round, but, you know, is there anything else? He's astonishingly modern, and he's a great antidote for people who think that the Middle Ages knew nothing, because he knows everything. Oh, and he's got a whole book devoted to which of the Greek philosophers is it most profitable for Christians to read. And he doesn't just talk about Plato. That's eventually his answer. He goes through and rehearses and catalogs and sketches about 20 different Greek philosophers. He says, well, this guy messes up here. And this guy, no point in reading him because of this. But now Plato, there's good reasons for us to read Plato. Plato is the one who approaches Christian doctrine the closest, which is really interesting because Plato was lost to the Middle Ages. Plato was never adequately translated into Latin, and the ability to read Greek had fallen almost completely off the face of Europe by 800, 900, and so Plato is almost like the undiscovered country. They get Aristotle back around 1200, but they don't get Plato until much later. But they knew, everybody who read Augustine knew Augustine's opinion, that Augustine's opinion was that Plato, of all the Greek philosophers, is the one most worth reading. Has a number of wonderful phrases. The city of God, he says, all of human history and all of the current habitation of mankind upon the face of the earth really divides up into two cities. There's the city of God and the city of man. And the city of God is dominated by the love of God to the neglect of self, and the city of man is dominated by the love of self and the rejection of God. And the city of man is furthermore characterized by, because the city of man's nature is so narcissistic and self-focused and greedy, in the city of man, the dominant driving force is the desire for power. And so in the city of man, people wind up at war with each other. And this Latin phrase, libido dominandi, the love of power, the lust for power. He says he's actually quoting Virgil from the Aeneid. This is in Virgil's great epic poem of the founding of Rome. These shall be your arts, impose the habit of peace, forgive the subdued and vanquish the proud. And that could be the Roman motto as expressed by Virgil, and Augustine quotes it. Two cities have been formed by two loves, the earthly by the love of self, even to the contempt of God, the heavenly by the love of God, even to the contempt of self. The former, in a word, glories in itself, the latter in the Lord. For the one seeks glory from men, but the greatest glory of the other is God, the witness of conscience. The one lift up lifts up its head in its own glory. The other says to its God, you are my glory, the lifter up of mine head. And in book 22, when you get to the end of, binging on the season of Augustine's podcasts, you've gone 22 books and they're 2 hours each if you just listen to them being read. He ends with the three incredibles. And this, to me, is always an inspiring passage from him. It is incredible that Jesus Christ should have risen in the flesh and ascended with flesh into heaven. It is incredible that the world should have believed so incredible a thing. It is incredible that a very few men of mean birth and the lowest rank and no education should have been able so effectually to persuade the world and even its learned men of so incredible a thing. And this is from a guy who was the Jordan Peterson of the 5th century. He had read everybody, and he had written 5 million words, and he was a polymath. He was intensely interested in everything and wrote about it. And there's a little footnote here that I slip into my slides because when I discovered it, I was just sort of floored. We know where he's buried. We know where his bones are, at least, and it's not in North Africa. The Vandals conquered North Africa. The Vandals became Arians, which is a heretical view of the Trinity. They don't believe in the equality of Jesus. I think Jesus is a created being, secondary divine figure. So that the Catholic bishops were expelled by the Arian Vandal king. And the Catholic bishops of North Africa took the remains of Augustine with them when they left Hippo about 480. Now, that's about 50 years after he died. Bede, people who've read Bede, he's the great historian of the English tradition. Bede tells that the remains were subsequently redeemed out of the hands of the Saracens when they conquered the island of Sardinia. That's where the Catholic bishops had gone. It's the island just in the Mediterranean, just north of North Africa. By Peter, Bishop of Pavia and the uncle of the Lombard king, and deposited in the church of St. Peter in Pavia about the year 720. And that's a picture of his tomb in the Church of St. Peter, Pavia, Italy. And the really interesting thing is, right around the corner is the tomb of Boethius in the same church. Sorry, makes a whole lot more sense to my students. We read one of his great works, The Consolation of Philosophy. He's another Roman Latin author who writes in the century after Augustine, a very famous work that's still in print and worth reading, and only about 100 pages. So kids like getting that as an assignment. The 5 million words that he wrote, he actually probably wrote more. We have 5 million words that he wrote. And the story of why we have them also tells the story of why he is so influential. There was a monastery in Hippo. There was a collection of monks. They preserved everything he had written. You remember, we're in the age where everything has to be copied by scribes. But they had preserved and made copies of everything that Augustine had written. When they were expelled, they took that library with them, and it wound up in southern Italy, just on an island off the coast of Naples. And we have this fellow, Eugippius of Castellum Luculum, 460 to 540. He provided a helpful summary. He wrote summaries. He wrote a little catalog of everything they had, all the scrolls that had been preserved. And he made Augustine's works. He edited them and improved them. And he had a network of contacts in the 6th century in the various provinces of the West. So Bede winds up with copies from Italy of all of Augustine's writings, which had been preserved by his monks in North Africa. He's the father. Bede is the Venerable Bede, is the father of English history. He planned and completed a commentary on all the books of the Bible, nearly completed. His commentary on the Pauline epistles. He wanted to write sort of a Matthew Henry guide to everything Paul wrote. It consists entirely of 455 quotations from 45 works by Augustine. It's basically Augustine's commentary on Paul, but compiled by Bede. And he identifies in that commentary title, book, and chapter from Augustine. And these guys are all working with handwritten manuscripts. It's just amazing. Florus of Lyon, a massive commentary on the letters of Paul, also exclusively from the works of Augustine, with 2,218 quotations from 70 works. One of those 70 is a collection of Augustine's sermons. Florus quotes from 150 different sermons. His manuscript still exists. We've actually got his notes with his handwriting and his compilation system on it. Which brings us down to Peter Lombard. Now, if you know anything about the development of the medieval university system, the medieval university system arose out of a desire to study theology more formally and beyond the cathedral schools, and the standard textbook became this book by Peter Lombard. It's actually 4 books, Sentences. From the 1220s until the 16th century, no work of Christian literature, except for the Bible itself, was commented upon more frequently. All the medieval thinkers, Albert the Great, Thomas Aquinas, who was one of Albert's students, William of Ockham, Gabriel Biel, were influenced by Peter Lombard's sentences. Even the young Martin Luther wrote glosses on Peter Lombard's sentences. When Luther got his doctorate in theology, he had to study Lombard's sentences. It was the textbook. John Calvin quotes from Lombard's sentences over 100 times in the Institutes. And we miss the continuity somewhere. And here's the interesting thing about Lombard's sentences. It's in 4 volumes, 1 volume on God and the Trinity, 1 volume on creation, 1 volume on Christ, 1 volume on the sacraments. There are 719 citations from Augustine in the sentences. He's the most quoted author. The second most quoted author is Ambrose with 66 citations. And Ambrose is Augustine's teacher. So, yeah. Here are the people who wrote on Lombard: St. Bonaventure, Thomas Aquinas, Scotus, Martin Luther. They all wrote commentaries on the sentences. Given the prominence of Augustine in Peter Lombard's sentences, it cemented the authority of Augustine through the latter half of the Middle Ages. So if you were going to university from 1200 on, and the first universities were founded about 1100, you read Lombard's sentences. That was the book that you needed to get. Before 1450, you needed to get a handwritten copy. After 1450, you started to be able to get a printed copy. But if you were reading Lombard's sentences, you were reading Augustine, predominantly, with all the other church fathers, but he was the most important. And then there's this amazing little connection. I had to sort of do a deep dive to track this one down. Bartolomeo da Urbino and Petrarch. Bartolomeo did a collection of quotes from Augustine, 15,000 extracts organized alphabetically by subject. And he was a friend of Petrarch, the great Renaissance humanist. In fact, Petrarch, the book is called the Mililoquium Veritatis Sant Augustini. Petrarch wrote a poetic foreword to the book when it was published. And Petrarch adopts Augustine as his guide and patron saint. In fact, he writes a dialogue of himself and Augustine back and forth called the De Secreto Conflictu, with Augustine as his father confessor. It's patterned after Augustine's Confessions. And in the dialogue that Petrarch is writing, he has the figure of Augustine, whom he's conversing with, accuse him, said, "You're not really a Christian, you're a Ciceronian. You love Cicero more than you love the New Testament. You spend more time reading your Latin authors than you do the Bible." Florence. Coluccio Salutati, Chancellor of Florence, one of the leading humanists of the early Renaissance. We think of the humanists, the Italian humanists, as skeptics. We mistake them for figures from the Enlightenment. They really weren't. Here's a letter that he wrote. He's one of the most famous men of the late 14th century, early 15th. He says, read Augustine on Christian doctrine, where he seems to touch the heights of eloquence. And certainly you will find the Ciceronian tradition renewed in the style of that great man. Augustine, exponent and champion of Christian faith, displayed such knowledge of the poets in all his writings that there is scarcely a single letter or treatise of his which is not crowded with poetic ornament. Not to speak of others, his city of God could never have been so strongly and so elaborately fortified against the vanity of the heathen if he had not been familiar with the poets, and especially Virgil. I mean, you've got the testimony here of an Italian humanist in around 1400 about the cultural awareness of Augustine, testifying that he's someone who has widely read and understands the times in which he's living and the literary tradition that goes back centuries from his own age. The age of print, after 1455, this is one of my minor little hobbies here, is tracing all of this. By 1500, within 45 years of Gutenberg starting the printing press up in Mainz, half of Augustine's total works had been printed. They were popular. The printers realized, hey, these sell well, we can make money. You got anything else by Augustine? Because the last one sold well. So Augustine is big business. Since 1500, Augustine's works have never gone out of print. They remain in print. Now, if you go on Amazon and type in Augustine, you will get a long list of books that you can buy right now, English translations of this guy who lived 1,600 years ago. He is still influencing us. So Augustine is not so much about what he wrote or how much he wrote, as impressive as that is, or how influential he's been, as impressive as that is. If you read him for yourself, his broad biblical worldview, his wrestling with Roman history, he goes right up against the Romans and he says, you tell these stories about your founding and you celebrate Romulus and Remus and the story. You celebrate the overthrow of the kings after the rape of Lucretia and her suicide, and you say that Lucretia is the epitome of Roman honor. She was wrong to kill herself. And Romulus is a terrible hero for you guys to be celebrating. He murdered his brother. So there is no point of connection between the story of Romulus and Remus and the story of Cain and Abel. The story of Cain and Abel is a split between the city of God and the city of man. Abel is the city of God. Cain is the city of man. The story of Romulus and Remus is what happens in the city of man. And so he's taking the Roman patriotic stories and he's flipping them on their head. The Roman Republic is founded because one of the Etruscan princes, raped the wife of a Roman nobleman, Lucretia. And she told her husband and his friends about it, and then she killed herself, and they threw the kings out and said, we're never going to have a king again. And Augustine, and it's very interesting, this is also, I think, a beautiful illustration of his pastoral heart as a bishop and a pastor. He's writing after the overthrow of Rome, and he's trying to defend the charge that, well, the pagan gods never would have let the Vandals or the Visigoths sack the city. It's because we've neglected our traditional gods that these Germanic barbarians have been able to come in and attack the city. And he says, no, that's not it at all. He said, and some of the pagan authors were criticizing women in Rome who had been raped during the sack of the city and then did not commit suicide. And he said, you are all so incredibly wrong. You are so wrong to bring the example of Lucretia up. Lucretia committed a sin in taking her own life, and she committed no sin when she was the victim of rape. And the women in Rome who were raped during the sack by the Germanic tribes have done nothing wrong. They have not been defiled. And any shame they feel should not be imputed to them, but to those who wronged them. And you are all wrong for advising them to commit suicide. They have done nothing. And you need to get off your high horse about Lucretia and give these women some counsel and support. It's really an interesting footnote to him and his reaction to all that. And again, an illustration, I think, of his his pastoral heart in all of his writing and all of his sermons, the same way. 5 million words, and we've still got them. That's the amazing thing. Well, I got a little bit of time left. That's my prepared remarks about him. I hope I gave you a little taste of him from the Confessions and the City of God. There's a lot more if you get interested and want to dive in, but if you do get interested, I would recommend starting with this. This is a new translation. I got this right off Amazon. You know, they have them in stock. They delivered this to me to the next day. And it's not, well, it's okay. It's 300 pages. But it's not anything like City of God, which is 800 pages. So, questions?
Best translation of City of God.
I read and teach from this older one. Let me get the translator here. It's a little more formal. Dodds. D-O-D-S. There are a couple of newer ones I've looked at and sampled. I don't like them for different reasons. This is actually all, been in print. I'm trying to think of when this was done. 1950. Yeah, this is from 1950, Random House. But I'm just saying, book 15, that the ark which Noah was ordered to make figures in every respect the Christ of the church. Inasmuch as God commanded Noah, a just man, and as the truthful scripture says, a man perfect in his generation, not indeed with the perfection of the citizens of the city of God, in that immortal condition in which they equal the angels, but insofar as they can be perfect in their sojourn in this world. Inasmuch as God commanded him, I say, to make an ark, in which he might be rescued from the destruction of the flood, along with his family, i.e. his wife, sons, and daughters-in-law, and along with the animals who, in obedience to God's command, came to him into the ark. This is certainly a figure of the city of God sojourning in this world. That is to say, of the church, which is rescued by the wood on which hung the mediator of God and men, the man, Christ Jesus. And then he goes off on a riff here. This is really funny, about how the dimensions of the ark are an analogy of the dimensions of a human body. That the length and the width and the height, if you lay a body down on its back and measure the three dimensions, the ark has the same relationship in the measurement. So he's looked into Genesis and thought about, what do the numbers mean? Why are they here? If you measure a man as he lies on his back, he is 6 times as long from head to foot as he is broad from side to side. Now this is, I'm thinking about, yeah, Jordan Peterson would love this. It's just the kind of thing Jordan would do.
One thing I remember, it's been many years ago since I perused City of God. But one thing I remember is he talked a bit about theater and his ideas on going to the theater.
Yeah. He does it in Confessions as well. He actually laments that he was, in his youth, very attracted to the games, the gladiatorial combats, and also to the theater. But you've got to remember the theater at his time, it's probably a mistake to think of it as broadly. The theater at his time included all sorts, everything from, high Greek tragedy to what we would call low Greek pornography. Without going into detail, like there are places on the internet you shouldn't go. And for Augustine, there are theatrical productions you shouldn't attend. And so his rejection of it, I think, is coming out of that cultural milieu. Because the theater was, Hippo Regius was a large enough city, a provincial capital, to have theatrical productions, not really any different in kind or variety from what was going on in Rome or Milan. And 400 AD, you're still talking a culture that the elites are actually still pagan. The middle class and the lower class have been converted to Christianity and are building churches, but the elites, the old money families in Rome, are still worshiping the pagan gods, and they would still like their gladiatorial combat. They regret that they've been stopped. They had been stopped by then. Augustine in his youth, though, still saw some. They were brought to an end. And so he's saying, yeah, I did things when I was a kid that I wish I hadn't done. He's very frank, very honest about it. And, the advantage of someone who became a Christian in their 30s, looking back and saying, well, yeah, thank goodness for my mother. She never gave up on me.
Well, that makes sense, because, even in City of God, it seems like he was going, be careful with how much time you spend in the theater and what kind of theater
Yeah.
you do. So I guess, that makes sense, what you're saying.
Yeah. Tom?
Is there a reason he never married? That was before the Catholic Church insisted that priests be celibate.
I think, there was no requirement, being a ordained a priest in 400 and even being bishop of Hippo, that he be single and celibate. I think it was because his own wrestling with sin had been over sex. And he just, it felt like I didn't need the distraction. The other thing that I think is quite interesting is that he and his mistress had a son, Adeodatus. And she left him. Actually, she had left him a year before he converted, and he found another mistress and didn't want to give her up. But this son, who was probably 11, 12 years old, when his mother just basically gave up on Augustine and left Milan and went to southern Italy, he was the great love of Augustine's life. Augustine was extremely affectionate and made provision for his education, kept him with him, included him. So he's a priest and a bishop, but he's a priest and a bishop and he's a father. Now, Adeodatus actually died. He died in his 20s, and sort of a tragic event in Augustine's own life. And there's some sermons where he talks about, how much the son had meant to him and how tragic his death was. So, beyond that, I don't recall him actually writing anything about the advantage or disadvantage of priests and bishops being married. Many were. It was not yet a common practice in the church. Anybody else? Yes.
If I'm remembering right, in Confessions, he wrestles with the idea of baptism because even though he wasn't a Christian, his mom baptized him as a baby.
He got very sick when he was about 10 or 11 years old, I think, and they feared that he would die. And so, his mom baptized him sort of on an emergency basis at home, but he never put much stock in it. He never felt like it was really a baptism. That too was not an uncommon practice. And because of especially infant and child mortality was so high, if you had a child who got very deathly ill, ran a high fever, and there was no treatment, then you might baptize them at home just on an emergency basis. And that's what his mother had done. But he never felt like it, was a real baptism. But he never felt like it, and he never felt like it precluded his being baptized in the church in Milan. And that wasn't an impediment. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming. I'll give you a little sneak preview. In December, we are going to talk about Dante, the Commedia. Dante, oh gosh, I don't know where to begin with him. It's 100 poems. And each poem is somewhere between 120 and 140 lines, and he invents a new poetic form for those 100 cantos. There are 34 that tell the story of the journey of Dante the Pilgrim through Inferno all the way to the bottom, and as they go descending, and Virgil is his guide. As they descend through the circles of hell, it gets colder. And the very bottom of Inferno is a lake of ice that imprisons Satan. Satan is not ruling over anything. He's a prisoner. So then he and Virgil, there's a secret passageway, and they emerge on the other side of the earth in the very last canto of Inferno. And where they emerge is an island in the middle of the hemisphere of water, because yes, Dante knew the world was round. There was a hemisphere of land with Jerusalem at its center and a hemisphere of water, and there was an island out there, and there was a mountain on the island. And that's Mount Purgatory. So he ascends. You got 33 poems ascending through purgatory. Purgatory is different from Inferno, though. Everybody on the mountain of purgatory is on their way to heaven. They're being sanctified, and they're progressing. In Inferno, everybody is locked in place wherever they are. Mount Purgatory, they're all moving up, and they're being sanctified from each of the vices and acquiring the virtues as they make their progress up the mountain. And at the very top, he discovers that at the very top of this mountain is the Garden of Eden. Not a symbol of the Garden of Eden, not something like the Garden of Eden. It's when Satan was thrown down, the original location. This is Dante's metaphoric, symbolic universe. The way Dante explains it, think of it as maybe sort of a sci-fi alt history version. It pushed up the mountain of purgatory underneath the original Garden of Eden, and the Garden of Eden now rests upon the top of the mountain. And at the top of the mountain, he meets his patron, the love of his life, Beatrice. She is united. Virgil can't go any further. And Beatrice then accompanies him in the third volume, Paradiso, up through the spheres of the heavens. And he sees various souls in heaven, but they're not really there. He's just talking to them in different voices. He finally gets through the outermost sphere and into the empyreans outside the universe. And he's in the presence of God. And the last poem is Dante the poet's attempt to describe what it was like to enter into the presence of God and to see God. It's the most audacious bit of poetic writing I think anybody has ever attempted to pull off, and he really does accomplish it. And there's an amazing symmetry, and there's some amazing threads that run all the way through that. The last word in Inferno, when they pop up on the island of Purgatory, is the stars. I saw the stars. And the last word in Purgatorio, when they get to the top of the mountain and he's reunited with Beatrice, she had died in the plague, but she's looking out for him. She's his guardian angel, or the stars. And then I was ready to begin my ascent through the stars. And the last word in Paradiso, when he understands the Trinity, has seen it and is trying to describe it, he said, and love is what moves the three persons and guides the stars. 100 poems times 140 lines, so 14,000 lines. And just, there's nothing else like it in the history of literature in any language. So I can go for a long time about him, but I'm going to try and distill down what I'm going to say and get it done in 45 or 50 minutes. Thank you all for coming. Hope I see you again next month. And I'm already sort of sketching out some ideas for the winter, for January, February, March. So we'll say some more about that later on. Thank you.